And in that committee meeting in your head, some voices are really loud and they dominate the conversation and they dictate the agenda of what's talked about. And they even shout down some other members of the meeting whose opinions they don't agree with, right? And your job as the inner leader is to manage their over contribution and to reach out to some of those quieter voices on your inner team that might have gifts for you that you've either forgotten were there, or you sort of accepted the belief that maybe they weren't your allies where they actually are. So the metaphor of the inner team is just a really, it's not unique to my system by any means, but it's a metaphor that allows people to take something that's really quite abstract and just get it, because who hasn't had an argument with themselves, right? And if you can get curious about, okay, so who's arguing? What's the point of view that each of these different positions in your argument is representing, and get curious about it, then magic happens.
Welcome to Leadership, the Secret Sauce, the podcast where we talk to extraordinary coaches and leaders to dive into the realms of leadership and coaching. We're your hosts, Dave Lipsky and Matt Dodson. So let's jump in with another guest and find out their answer to the question, what is your secret sauce? Welcome to Leadership, the Secret Sauce with coaches Dave Lipsky and Matt Dodson. Before we begin, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Character Matters Coaching and Consulting, where they believe that your character is the compass guiding you through life's journey. Whether you're facing personal or professional challenges, they are dedicated to helping you discover and strengthen the core values that define who you are. Dave, what do we have today?
I am excited to welcome in Paul. And it's been about 5 years or more since we had a chance to connect. So I'm really excited to reconnect with you, find out some of the things you've been doing since we last talked. And just to start, like as you are riding in an airplane or you're sitting in a conference and somebody turns to you and say, Paul, what do you do? How do you answer that question?
My current answer is I have interesting conversations for a living. And then I stop talking.
And they fill it in.
They fill it in. It's fascinating. And that's essentially how I see coaching. Interesting conversations about things that matter.
That's so cool. I like that. We're gonna dive more into that. To start with, your energy level on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being low, 10 being high. Where about are you right now?
So I'm going to give you a little bit of a confusing answer to that. So a part of me is like about a 9.5, because it's always exciting to meet with other coaches and have a conversation about stuff that I can geek out on, right? And there's another part of me that's about a 4.5, because it's Friday afternoon. It's been a long week, and I'm also really tired. So both are true.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Like I'm on East Coast time in New York, a little bit above New York City. So it is happy hour. I have nothing in the glass, but I did Matt that I was going to start drinking. You're welcome to partake. I'm probably at like an 8.5. Matt, how about you?
You know what? Actually, I was going to say 8.5. I'm good with 8.5. I don't think I'm at a 9 right now, but 8.5 is pretty good.
Awesome. Good. Yeah, it's good. It's a good foundation to build off of. And it's in terms of, I want to go back, like what you said about like an interesting conversation. And I love like that lens of how you see, like when you're looking across from a client, what are you looking for to like get to that interesting conversation?
I mean, I suppose probably like a lot of coaches, I follow the energy. Where is there something which deviates from whatever their normal is? Something that lifts them, something that drops them, but where there's a shift in energy. So that's what I'm often really trying to tune into.
Yeah. Paul, what would you say is your secret sauce?
So I think there's a bit of a story to my answer to that. So I'll try and
Sure.
kind of summarize it, and then we can go as deep into it as you wish to. I think the secret sauce for me is a particular view I have of who we are and how we work and how we grow, which is that within all of us, there is many of us, right? We're all multiple. People don't have a single personality. We have many. And that is such a simple idea, but it has ripples through the entire coaching process. And it's a way of relating which is just incredibly life-giving and relational and expansive. And so I think once I got that in my bones, it changed everything about how I work.
That is really curious. I makes me curious. Like how did you know? How did you come upon that? Did you read it somewhere? Did you just go like it was in a coaching session and you're like, hmm, I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll give you a short version of kind of my origin story because I started coaching in 1998. So I've been doing this a while. But before I even became trained as a coach, I was involved in a bunch of different personal growth work just in my own development. And there was a particular framework that I was trained in the early 90s, mid 90s actually, called voice dialogue, which is a form of parts work. It's been around for 50 plus years. And it unlocked a way of being for me that I just didn't have access to before that. So I would say the sort of the before the unlock, what you would have seen if you'd met me then is someone who's full of his own importance and has to be the expert, has to know the answer, has to be right, and that part of me's still around. It doesn't run me anymore, but it's still there. And what this particular process enabled me to do was to go, okay, that's a part of who I am. It's not all of who I am. And what's the rest of who I am? And
Mm.
the part that got unlocked is the part that doesn't know and is curious and can kind of live in the sort of the innocence of discovering something as you go along. And that part wasn't available to me until I did this parts work process. So you might say it's like I was identified with the expert part of me before, and afterwards I had access to the learner part of me. And only once I had access to the learner could I coach, because otherwise I'd have been advising or teaching or experting on my clients and with predictable results.
As you were saying that, I pictured you're driving your coach car and you're telling your ego self to get to the back seat, or the one that has all the answers, and you're inviting something else into the front seat. How does that work for you as you
Right.
coach? And then how would a client experience the other side of it?
Yeah. So my coaching probably isn't sort of ICF standard. I mean, I have my credentials or whatever, but I don't really ascribe to that particular frame of coaching because my coaching actually includes a fair amount of teaching. So you still see my expert, it still shows up. The difference is I don't have to be right about what I'm saying, right? I can offer something as an idea or as a framework unattached to whether they agree with me or even whether it's useful. Right. So you'll still see that side and you'll see what you would recognize in most coaches, which is this curious side and the part that will just sort of explore and be open and be unattached to where we go or how we get there or, what particular process seems to move the conversation forward.
Paul, I think you were one of the first people that really kind of talked about how I met you while you were still at your former company prior to really kind of going out on your own. I heard you describe something in terms of taking care of yourself as a coach, of like what you needed to do. Let me just let me relate it to this idea around the expert and is that tied like, hey, I need to make sure that if I'm going to be doing all of this coaching and all this like deep listening and really just this curiosity, how do I actually take care of myself so I don't actually just have the expert running the coaching show? How do you do that?
Yeah. There's a awareness that comes when you start to look at yourself in this parts view. So the first thing that happens, you start to realize you've got all these different parts, right? So if you have an argument with yourself about something like you're debating what you should do around a decision, you'll hear multiple different parts of yourself weigh in with opinions, right? So the initial phase of trying to understand yourself as multiple is getting really fascinated with the parts. But there's this really interesting phenomenon that happens is that as you start to recognize, oh my gosh, I've got this expert part, I've got this learner part, I've got this part that thinks that my value comes from what I produce and how fast I produce it. I've got another part that thinks that the only thing that's important in the world is my connection with spirit, right? So I've got all these different parts. What happens as I start to recognize I am this multiple, by the way, this is all of us, right? We are all wired this way, is something naturally emerges behind that. And what I mean by that is that you start to realize that actually you have all these parts, but they don't have you. They don't get to dictate your behavior. So when I say I have an expert within me, who's the I in that sentence? There's actually this witness of all of these different parts. So when bringing it back to your question about sort of self-care, I think the essence of this approach is to center yourself not in any one part, because they all have gifts, but they can all cause trouble when you overuse them. But when you can actually center yourself in what we call in the system that I've created, the inner leader. And if you're familiar with internal family systems, which is the major parts work system that's out there right now, they call it self or self energy. When you're centered in that, there's a looseness that comes with that. There's a calm, there's a presence, there's a compassion. It's just naturally, that's not effortfully there. It's naturally there. And it's like you're resourced not just by your parts, but by something greater than all of them. And for me, that's been the great gift of what comes through when you take this kind of parts view. And obviously, I've certainly had that experience in my own life as a practitioner. But when you see clients get it, like suddenly they've gone from being really agitated and caught up in some internal dialogue they're having with themselves. And suddenly there's this like calm, wise, present human there. It's like nothing else. It's kind of addictive, actually.
How would you like if that was like a summary trip of Europe or something? Like, how would you describe that journey to somebody like who's first talking to you and wants to understand what's that process or journey look like?
Yeah, I don't tell them very much about the theory or the framework because they might get curious about it later, but you don't need to know it coming in. I generally just listen for parts and reflect them back. So, clients will often even use language and that points at parts. They'll say things like, well, a part of me wants to tell my boss what I really think, and a part of me thinks I should keep my big mouth shut. Right. So you'll hear people talk about different aspects of who they are. And all you have to do to start to invite them into this exploration is to say, well, would you like to get to know those two parts of who you are a little better? And then suddenly you're into that conversation. So you just draw it out of their experience. And what's fascinating about it is people feel seen. And there's that lovely sense of just being the compassionate witness of what's occurring, what's already there, right? And later on, they often want to know, well, what is this? What are all these parts? And how do they work? And how do I work with them? And all of that comes later, but you need like an experience of them first. So this approach is always about trying to be a witness to parts and then ultimately having your clients learn to witness their own parts. And often naming it is a piece of that too. So learning to name the different parts of you, like the expert and learner example I gave earlier, would be examples of that.
For those of you who don't know, Paul used to be a coach at a big firm that I would imagine that these people would be like, what in the world? So what I just appreciated what you just did is you made the discussion on parts very practical.
Yeah, that's
And I don't have to adopt,
right.
I don't have to adopt a framework. You're actually just actually pointing out to them how they already describe that
Yeah,
framework.
right. So a lot of the people I worked with in this organization were CPAs by training, right? A good more than majority of them. And in the model that I was trained in, the language is very psychological. So that quality of presence that witnesses all of these other parts in the system I was trained in, you know what that was called? It was called the aware ego process. Now, can you imagine a CPA in a big firm being able to start sort of get hold of a concept like the aware ego process? It's like, it's just not accessible. It points to something really important, but the language doesn't work. Whereas when you say to them, there's this quality that you may be experiencing, which we call the inner leader, the
Mm.
part of you that can lead all of these different parts of who you are in a way that's aligned with what it is you want to produce. And they get it. So, I mean, but basically the metaphor does the work. So the metaphor is you have an inner team, all of these parts of you are like members of a team, again, totally relatable to someone in a business context. And in that committee meeting in your head, some voices are really loud and they dominate the conversation and they dictate the agenda of what's talked about. and they even shout down some other members of the meeting whose opinions they don't agree with, right? And your job as the inner leader is to manage their over contribution and to reach out to some of those quieter voices on your inner team that might have gifts for you that you've either forgotten were there, or you sort of accepted the belief that maybe they weren't your allies where they actually
Mm.
are. So the metaphor of the inner team is just a really, it's not unique to my system by any means, but it's a metaphor that allows people to take something that's really quite abstract and just get it, because who hasn't had an argument with themselves, right? And if you can get curious about, okay, so who's arguing? What's the point of view that each of these different positions in your argument is representing, and get curious about it, then magic happens.
Dave, you know what, I have just another to just actually sort of put it. I think it's really important as a coach that I would just say that the knowledge or the familiarity or the listening for these people that may be technical, or they, I have to pay attention enough to the words that they're using to really say, like, hey, oh, you just used that word. Like, hey, one part of me just wants to tell my boss where to go. And then to just get really curious about that one part of you. Let's talk a little bit about that. Asking for permission and then actually just going there. It just seems
Exactly.
like that's a depth that maybe that's really hard to unlock without just a curious person to ask.
Well, there's a dynamic that happens in this where most of us grow up in a view of ourselves, which is that we have, like, because we have like one body and one brain, we also have therefore one personality, our character. And that personality has like good parts and bad parts, right? So growth in that way of viewing yourself is, well, my job is to emphasize the good parts of who I am, whatever you judge those to be, and to manage or minimize or even try and get rid of what you consider the bad parts. And the problem with that is that the premise of this entire body of work is that there are no bad parts, that every part of you is protective. It has a particular strategy, a particular schema, a particular view of the world. And what it's there to do is to try and protect you. It just does that in a range of different ways. And so the alternative is this sort of multiple mind view of yourself, where you say, actually, I have one body and one brain, but there's many of me here. And all of those parts are resourceful. All of those parts have a particular point of view, which might be really valuable to me. And my goal isn't to sort of sort them between good and bad and get rid of the bad ones. It's to integrate them all, to have the most diverse and sort of inclusive inner team possible, because just like diversity in the outer world, like the more different points of view you have, the better decisions you make. Same's true inwardly. So when you have clients who, for example, I've got a really difficult, complex, non-obvious decision to make, and they're approaching it entirely from the sort of rational, evidence-based part of who they are. And you can say to them, well, okay, we've heard from what your rational part says about this decision. Is there another part of you that has an opinion? And universally, it's right there. And they will be able to bring that forward. And you can run through multiple different perspectives in a single conversation. And suddenly they come out of it a lot smarter. And you're not telling them as the coach how they should think differently. They're just sourcing internally all these different kinds of points of view. And they're all valid and they're all useful. And then the inner leader's role is to decide what parts of you they can act on from each of them. So it's fascinating to watch how it plays out.
Trying to put this in a picture of, and tell me if I'm putting it in a place that works, but I'm trying to picture like the role of the inner leader and like what sport or function the team members are playing. What comes to mind as you think about like somebody trying to orchestrate or coach or do something with these parts?
The best metaphor is the orchestra and the conductor. So you actually use the word orchestrate, Dave, which is very perceptive of you. Yeah, so you can think of the inner leader as being like a conductor. They may not be playing an instrument. They don't have a particular agenda for what it wants you to do. But it can look at the piece of music and the effect that they want the music to create and say, okay, more violin, less tuba, or whatever the mix is that's needed to have that music, or we need to pick up the pace here, or we need to quieten down here. All of those kind of moves, it's like the conductor's moves. So they don't write the music, they don't play the music, but they allow all of the different parts to kind of harmonize. So that would be the best metaphor I can think of for that. As opposed to, you can imagine what an orchestra would sound like if you let every instrumentalist kind of be a soloist. It just cacophony doesn't begin to capture it. And yet that's a lot of what our internal dialogue is like without the inner leader managing, because one of the principles of the work is, in the absence of the inner leader, these dominant parts of who we are take over. So in the business world, most people are run by a pusher part of who they are, the part that's action focused and urgency driven and task focused and just want us to get stuff done as fast as possible. That's the dominant part in most organizations. The responsible part, the part that says, I have to keep my word and do what I said. There's the perfectionist part that says you have to do it to this standard, and if you don't, it's shameful. So you could keep going, but there are many, many parts like that can completely run a leader inside an organizational context. And part of what we're trying to do in this work is have leaders not have less of that way of being, because it's often the source of a lot of their gifts, but to bring that into balance with other ways of being that naturally allow the strengths of both to come forward. So one of the parts of the system, which is fascinating, if you're familiar with polarities, there are internal polarities between parts. So for example, that pusher part that's all about action has an opposite that's called being. So with the pusher is doing, the opposite of that is around being. So it's a part of who we are that doesn't feel like it has anywhere particularly to get to, likes to take its time to think and reflect, will rest and relax as a way of generating energy, and is much more focused on sort of presence and purpose than on there's somewhere we have to get to. So
Mm.
you imagine a leader being able to integrate those two, they become infinitely, the action that their pusher wants them to take becomes infinitely more powerful and present when they can integrate that part of who they are. It also allows them to take breaks and not burn out. So there's some other very tactical benefits
Mm.
to.
Paul, what would you want from a coach when you're thinking about finding a coach? What are you looking for?
For me, if I had to put it in a sentence, it's permission to be human. So, there's no right or wrong way for me to be. I am exactly as I am, and whatever I might bring forward is data, and we can get curious about it and explore it. So, that sense that I have to be different to be okay is the thing I push against. And I don't like that feeling, and obviously try not to give that to my clients. So the essence of what I want is someone to witness me and be curious about me, and that invites my own curiosity about myself, or myselves, really.
What would you recommend what are some resources or books would you recommend? And I actually just saw recently on LinkedIn, so I'm gonna have you maybe shamelessly plug that there is something that you recently also like, didn't
Uh,
you recently publish a book too, Paul? Like,
yeah, I wrote a
so
book to capture kind of the system I've been describing, which I called
mm,
Part of Me, because it's the language we use when we talk about our parts. So it goes through some of the theory and the framework that I've given you, kind of a light version of, but it profiles 50 of these parts that are commonly
mm,
occurring that people will recognize in themselves, and sort of shows how each of them is protective and what happens when you overuse each one, and which pairs balance each other. So yeah, it's a book that just came out in May, and it was a lot of fun to write.
mm.
So yeah, I would recommend that. There's your shameless plug.
Any other things that you'd recommend? Yeah.
I like it. I have a follow up to that before, like,
Sure.
and there's a little sarcasm, and so I apologize in advance. Which part of you wrote that book?
There's actually a chapter in the book about which parts of me tried to help me write the book. there's a there's sort of a personal narrative at the end of the book about this, about how I had to engage with that expert that I was telling you about, who really wanted me to get at least a couple of PhDs before I put
Mm.
pen to paper and put any kind of information out there. The perfectionist part of me that wanted me to edit as I was going along and make every sentence perfect and would not let me finish anything because there could always be better, right? And the pusher part that was like, you must hit your words per day target or you're a worthless piece of you know what. So I had to engage with those parts of who I am and also encourage myself to find the opposites of those in order to get the book written. So there's actually a story in the book about exactly what that journey was for me.
Mm.
But let's just say writing about the inner team was a pretty close encounter with my own.
I hear orchestration and a little bit of mediation and negotiation as well.
That's right. Well, and it's kind of fun because there's a big difference between like beating myself up for something because something isn't happening the way I want and going, "Oh, hi perfectionist. Thanks for showing up. Let me listen to you and your point of view, and I can take that in and decide what I want to do with it." So I meet them as familiar friends as opposed to, "Oh my God, you again. Would you please get lost? I'm trying to get something done here." Right? So you actually make friends with all of these parts of who you are, and
Mm.
it's a very, I don't know, just a very accepting way of being with all of who you are, as opposed to some sort of judgment of good and bad.
What are like some of the things that you've read, experienced that got you to the a part of me? Like kind
Yeah,
of like what's in your pre-story that got you?
sure. Well, the original book in that voice dialogue framework is called Embracing Ourselves, and it's a fabulous starting point. A lot of people have built on it since because it's been out a long time now, but that's a fantastic one. That's Hal and Sidra Stone, who are the founders of Voice Dialogue. That one I really recommend. And the other thing I incorporate heavily in this work that I do now is polarity management. And so this idea of sort of internal polarities. But Barry Johnson's book of polarity management is one that really changed how I think. I've shared it with so many clients in so many different organizational contexts. And it gives you, I mean, I'm sure you guys know, it gives you a framework that just names something we've all experienced and we don't know how to work with until you can kind of get some distance from it. So I love polarity management. So those are two that I've learned a lot from and I recommend a lot.
Mm.
Yeah, I love the aha of polarity management where people are realizing like we actually weren't fighting against each other. Like it's like a whole other it's a mental framework. We're like, so
Yeah, and people get that internally when they realize that some part of themselves they thought was their saboteur. I don't like that language at all, but people often identify parts as sabotaging what they want when they realize that part was just trying to protect them just in a different way. It's
Mm.
like, oh my God, that what I thought was my enemy is actually my ally. It's kind of a cool experience that people have.
so sure there are no bad parts.
Yes.
All
And that
right.
would be the other book, actually, would be Dick Schwartz's book from IFS called No Bad Parts. So that's where that language comes from. So
Oh,
one,
I love that. I love that.
I think, just to take a step, Paul, just to give Dave and I a moment to reflect, because you said something, this idea, like, rather than resisting some of these things and pushing against it, well, I don't want to be,
yeah,
and I paid special attention to this idea around being and doing, because I find as a coach, my job a lot of times is to to be the human being and listen to the coachee that's busy doing, right? So it becomes an opportunity for the coachee to actually be around someone that is a being and they're the doing. And all of a sudden it opens up and unlocks different things.
beautiful.
But I think I can really relate to this idea around resisting some of the things that would be like, well, if I just weren't like that, rather than just saying, well, I'm not going to resist that. There's probably either something that I'm protecting, or there may be something good that I just don't see.
So
And
how does that thing that you have
yeah,
questioned, it's whether it's trying to help you, how is it trying to protect you? And if you just
yeah,
ask that question, it'll shift your relationship with it.
yeah. So I appreciate that. It actually sort of gave me just a bit, like, all of a sudden I saw this image of a coach and a client just actually be in that, the being and the doing part,
Yeah,
and to really try to encourage even in to the coachee. the being. And maybe sometimes the coach is maybe the first time that they've actually spent some time with a human being rather than just a human doing. So
Beautiful.
I really appreciate that insight. Dave,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts? What's your insight?
I'm in the same place as you, Matt. I think what is so many interesting things, like the foundation of kind of humanistic psychology is, like accepting who you are, right, and supporting that positive regard. And organizations like are not designed to do that, right? Like the organizations that people live in. So I feel like it changes my mental model a little bit of like, as opposed to asking where is that voice in your head coming from, like listening to it as a part of you, or accepting as a part of you in a positive way, and saying, all right, what can you do with it? It just seems much more aligned with our values and why we do what we do. So thank you. And I'm gonna read your book, and I'm interested in how you use that, and how you also use it to teach coaches, because I think it can change the framework a bit also for them.
It really does. I mean, if I can build just briefly on what you were saying, Matt, about being and doing as such a sort of a central sort of tension that every coach has to work with and clients can really benefit from working. There are two or three others that are part of this system that are just equally important, like responsibility and play. That's a huge polarity for people to figure out, especially in organizations where responsibility is valued and play not so much. Perfectionist and messy. The opposite of perfectionist is messy. You get people to embrace the sort of the chaos and spontaneity and creative mess, as opposed to things have to be just buttoned up and perfect. So I can keep going. There's hundreds of them. But of head and heart, right? Thinking and feeling, just being able to integrate this. So there are so many of these that if as coach we can hold that tension in ourselves, we get to hold a space for both of these as beautiful in our clients. And I keep using this phrase, but magic happens when we do that.
Paul, how could someone out of our listeners find where you are, get in touch with you? How do they buy your book?
I mean, the book's on Amazon, so that's the easiest way. It's called Part of Me. They can get in touch with me through LinkedIn, welcome connections there. Also, the website for this program of parts work is called Inner Team Dialogue. So it's just innerteamdialogue.com. And all of my contact information is on the site there, so people can find me there.
Yes, a plug for our sponsor. Are you feeling stuck or overwhelmed? Character Matters Coaching and Consulting provides leadership coaching and consulting to empower you to overcome obstacles and reach your full potential. Visit charactermatterscoaching.com to learn more about their transformative coaching and how to get connected to Matt for your organization. Paul, thank you so much for hanging with us and describing your approach and your process. It's so good to like reconnect with you and see where you are on your journey. And it makes me more curious and interested in pursuing different things in coaching. So that's one of the reasons I love doing this with Matt and speaking to amazing people like yourself.
Having interesting conversations for a living, right?
We're right
That's
back to
right.
that.
Exactly. Thank you both. This is really fun.
Thank you, Paul. And until next time, have a great day. Thanks for listening. If you love this podcast, please share it with another coach or leader. Make sure you go to the show notes to get all the resources from today's episode.